Now, before flying to Fort Bragg, Trump told reporters that he will use very heavy force against protesters marching in Los Angeles.
Oh, the military will be very heavy force. I'm very proud to tell you that. They might as well turn around. They're wasting their time. Some of them will end up in jail for a long period of time.
Now, Trump's remark came as police and protesters continue to face off in Los Angeles, the city's fifth day of demonstrations against deportation actions. Protests in front of a federal detention center continue as hundreds of U.S. Marines and National Guards arrived under orders from the U.S. president.
Immigration crackdown and following protests that began in LA have spread across the country as well. It first spread within the state of California to San Francisco and capital Sacramento. In Texas, protests were reported in Dallas, Austin, Houston and San Antonio. People also took to the streets in New York, Philadelphia, Boston and Chicago.
In Texas, multiple people were detained in two major cities of Dallas and Austin after a street showdown with police officers. Protesters also scuffled with police on the streets of Chicago, while a march took place in New York to protest immigration raids.
U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was grilled by U.S. House Appropriations Committee on the cost of deployment of troops in L.A. He made it absolutely clear that the deployment of troops for Homeland Security will expand under Trump.
National Guard and Reserve bring great value, not to mention the civilian skills.
Guard is heard at the policy level pursuant to my job as chairman.
I think we're entering an even another phase, especially under President Trump with his focus on the homeland, where the National Guard and Reserves become a critical component of how we secure that homeland and apply those civilian sets across the spectrum.
For more on this, we're now joined by Stephen Golub, political analyst and lawyer. He is widely recognized international development consultant and scholar with more than 30 years of experience in over 40 countries across the globe. Thank you so much for joining us on World DNA. Always a pleasure to have you.
Good to be here.
Now, in your view, does the deployment of military forces to manage protests risk normalizing the use of armed forces to handle domestic dissent? What might this mean for future protest movements as well?
Great question. And yes, this is very dangerous. It's unprecedented for a president to call in the National Guard and especially the Marines, the U.S. Armed Forces, in this manner under these kinds of circumstances. And really bear in mind the big picture here is that this is not wholly or even mainly about immigration. That is what President Trump is doing. It's not mainly about immigration. It's about opening up the doors to suppress dissent, to suppress protests, to suppress opposition in all sorts of ways down the line. In your excellent introduction, you really do give a taste of that. He's talking about calling opponents insurrectionists, in effect calling them traitors. He's saying that there's an invasion by these people who are immigrants here. Whether or not you consider them here to be illegal, they're not invaders in any sense in which the Constitution or any of our laws would justify military use for defense on domestic ground. So it's a very, very dangerous thing he's doing. He's doing it intentionally. It's part of his playbook. And while we can have legitimate debates about immigration policy, the really big thing that's going on here is President Trump's attempt to suppress opposition, really.
Mr. Golub, the terms that he's used, foreign enemy, agitators, insurrectionists, it's almost seeming, at least it gives the sense that it justifies the calling of the National Guard and elite forces. At this point, do you feel, and critics are arguing that this could be a political maneuver rather than a security necessity. What are your views on that front?
Oh, it's very much a political maneuver. Look, Los Angeles is not a little town. It has 9,000 police officers. The governor of California and the mayor of Los Angeles could call in thousands of more officers from state forces and from other local forces. So they could handle these protests of hundreds, or even if there were thousands of people involved, pretty easily if left to their own devices, which is what other presidents have done when we've had protests about all sorts of issues in the past. But this is not what President Trump wants. He wants to exacerbate the situation. And let's also bear in mind a real irony here, a very sad, tragic irony. On January 6, 2021, President Trump spent over 3 hours just watching on television as commander-in-chief when more than 1,000 people sacked the U.S. Capitol, many of them doing so violently, injuring 150 police officers, resulting in the deaths of several police officers over the following days. And he did nothing about that. He then went ahead, after these people had been convicted of crimes in their raid on the Capitol, and pardoned them, calling them patriots and heroes. What kind of contrast is that? What kind of sad, dangerous contrast is that with his overreacting intentionally to these legitimate protests in Los Angeles by calling in the National Guard and the U.S. Marines in an unprecedented and very, very arguably illegal manner?
Mr. Golub, I just want to take a little forward view here with your perspective. It's been 5 days already. We're only seeing the tensions rise. We're seeing more troops being called in, and there are now talks of troops also being deployed in other cities. If this continues in this manner, if we just focus on California, what's the game plan going forward? Is it just to suppress the protests, or is there a further change in administration also perhaps on the cards?
In fact, Shivan, if I could just add to that, yes. I would also like to discuss the legality of this. What are the constitutional limits that may be in place, especially without the governor's consent in calling in the National Guard? So just to understand that as well.
Okay, on the legality first, it's very arguably illegal what he's doing, that he doesn't have the authority to do this. You really have to have extraordinary circumstances, such as an invasion, and this is not an invasion in any common sense use of the term. The fact that you have people who are in the country illegally, almost all of them working peacefully, contributing to the economy. We could have a debate about whether they should be deported or not, but they're not invading the country. Another case would be if they're endangering national security or if they're insurrectionists. That's the language that he's using. But they're not endangering national security. They're not insurrectionists. The protesters are not insurrectionists. So really, it's a very thin or non-existent ground that he's basing all these actions on, especially calling in the U.S. Marines. The National Guard is bad enough, but almost always the National Guard is simply called in by the governor of a given state. For your information, they're usually part-time soldiers who just train on weekends and are deployed in crises or if there's a natural disaster. So there's really no legal basis for it. Going forward in California, I think he wants the situation to get worse, and it may get worse before it gets better, and this crackdown could spread to other states, and as I've emphasized, it could be used for other reasons, including trying to disrupt our congressional elections next year, which may be a real target or really part of his strategy to pave the way for using military force to take over state government functions or to disrupt protests or to suppress dissent in other ways.
The voices of critics have definitely become louder as the days progress, and we see more and more protesters coming to the streets and more forces coming in from both sides. Tensions only seem to be rising in Los Angeles along with other cities. Thank you so much for joining us. That was Stephen Golub. Always a pleasure speaking with you, sir.
Thanks for having me.